Hello and welcome to the Lund University International Podcast. On the show, you'll hear from current students, alumni, teachers, and many more special guests as we explore what it's really like to live and study in Lund. My name is Maria Lindblad, and I am a recruitment manager here at Lund University. Today we have with us two very special guests, and they are going to talk about a topic that we know that many of you are thinking about right now. So we'll actually jump straight into the introduction. So welcome, Louise and Erik. So please tell us who you are and what your roles are here at Lund University.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. Shall I start?
Absolutely.
So my name is Louise Corrigan-Konow. I am the Lund University Student Migration Coordinator. I started in this position in 2018, so I've been working here for 6 years. And before that, I worked as a decision maker at the Migration Agency, as did my colleague sitting next to me, Erik.
Yep. Right, yeah. So my name is Erik Kvist. I am the migration coordinator for HR and staff, and I have been working at the university in this capacity since December 2020. So 3.5 years now. Love it. It's so fun, really stimulating and dynamic, and such a cool job to have in a really interesting and inspiring setting as well. Before this, I also worked as executive case officer or decision maker at the Migration Agency, like Louise said, and LGBTQ specialist there as well. And I've also worked with migration at the Swedish embassy in Beijing.
Mm-hmm. Exciting. Well, we're really happy to have you here today, and we know that a lot of complex questions come your way on a daily basis, and we know that a lot of our incoming students have a lot of questions. So I think we're going to start there. So Louise, explain a little bit how we can support the incoming students who are just about to start their process applying for a residence permit to come and study here in Sweden.
Yes, well, I would say that we provide a great amount of support for our incoming students because we understand, I think, better than anyone having worked at the Migration Agency, that there is a lot of support required to navigate this process. In theory, on paper, an applicant should be able to apply for their residence permit just going by the information on the Migration Agency website. However, we know that in real life, a lot of different scenarios arise, and students very often need individual guidance with regards to securing their residence permit. So we do a whole host of events, really. We organize webinars, we have information sessions, live and online, Q&A, and what I do quite a lot in my everyday working life is that I simply respond to emails. I receive, I would say, up to maybe 80 to 100 emails per week from students, incoming and current students, I should clarify, who want to talk about their specific circumstances. Perhaps they have questions, concerns, worries, or a specific situation has arisen. And I essentially just help them through that with regards to my own experience from the Migration Agency, obviously the university's guidelines and recommendations, and also Swedish migration law.
Yeah, wow. What are some of the most common questions that you receive in this phase when they're just kind of starting to do their application, or perhaps they have started and they get tripped up somewhere? What's the most common question?
Well, we receive a lot of questions about the main requirements for securing a residence permit. I would say the funding requirement is one of those major aspects where students have a lot of questions and concerns. It's also a deeply personal issue. It relates to your funding. And we know, and we have a lot of empathy for the fact that a lot of students have perhaps saved, or their family has saved, and now they're coming to Sweden, they're embarking on their studies, and they need to secure their residence permit and show the Migration Agency that they have adequate funding. So we receive a lot of questions about that, and that's also partly to do with the fact that the Migration Agency is very strict when it comes to meeting the funding requirement. It's very different in different countries. In some countries, perhaps it's just a matter of showing that you have access to the funds, whereas in Sweden, with the Swedish Migration Agency, they want to go a little bit deeper in this regard with this requirement. So I receive a lot of questions about that. We also have this new passport control review step that we have in Sweden. And I receive a lot of questions about that. What does that mean, having to travel to a Swedish embassy to have your passport verified? And then also we receive questions about stay back permits, remaining in Sweden after your studies have ended. What are your opportunities, alternatives with regards to remaining in Sweden?
Yeah, exactly. We're going to get into that as well a little bit later. But as you say, I think it's very interesting, this fact that it does look very different in different countries. So students may be familiar with or have a family member who's traveled and to study or work in another country, and they just assume that it's going to be the same in Sweden, of course. And so, as you said, it's very important to check the details for the requirements. That is a very common mistake, I suppose, that students just, I have the funding, it's fine, or I'll send this letter, they'll accept that.
Absolutely. And I think also Sweden, we have to be quite sort of sympathetic to the fact that we are part of the Schengen area, meaning that we are alike to many other countries in our region. However, we are, of course, sovereign and unique. So we have a lot of, I noticed we have a lot of students who have experience from another country, a neighboring country in the region, and they have experience from that country, and they just automatically transfer that to Sweden. We have to spend a lot of time explaining Swedish migration law, the Swedish Aliens Act. So quite a few things to take into consideration. Also language, terminology. Yeah. In Sweden, a residence permit is your right to remain in Sweden, whereas a visa is just for visiting. Whereas I know that in a lot of other countries, they use visa for a residence permit. Yeah. So that's something I emphasize quite a lot, because it matters when you seek help. Using the right terminology will then get you the help that you need, as opposed to misusing words or phrases.
Exactly. And I think that's such an important point, because we who also have a lot of communication with the students, we often get that question as well. What are the requirements for a visa? How do you get a student visa? How do you get a study visa? And it's like, you're not actually applying for that. Yeah. So just getting the basics right is important, as you say. Yeah.
And also another thing, sorry if I could just interject, another thing that I find is really valuable with our position, both of us, is that we are somebody just to talk to. I think a lot of people listening to this will have experience with the Swedish migration agency, that sometimes it is difficult to get through. It's a long waiting time sending an email, phoning. Sometimes you can't really get a hold of someone when you want to speak with them. So we have a lot of students who email simply with a question to the migration agency, but they haven't been able to post that question. So we will then either answer it or help relay it to the migration agency. And I think it's just someone who's just at the other end, who's there responding to them, helping them, available all throughout the year, 5 days a week, available to help.
Yeah, and just knowing that somebody is there, like you said, to actually listen to them is maybe the most important part of your roles in one way. But just, this may sound to a listener complicated, or like there are so many different things, but can you just very briefly, without getting into details, explain like the step-by-step, like what is the first thing you have to do, the second, the third, etc. How many steps are there?
Of course.
What do you actually have to do?
I mean, this can be a complex process, but it can also be quite an easy process. Essentially, it's just following a checklist and a guide. So essentially, of course, first you are admitted to a university, Lund University in this scenario, we hope. And then you pay your tuition fee, you get the invoice for that, you pay your tuition fee, and then you apply. And you need to meet a certain set of requirements, but these aren't too difficult to meet. So I want to obviously help tell my story and provide the experience that I have, but I don't necessarily want to scare anyone listening to this, because the requirements are quite intuitive and they should be easy to follow. You need to show that you have funding. You need to show that you are insured. We provide that insurance. You need to show your passport. You need to upload any documentation relating to family members if you're bringing those. It's quite easy. You need to pay the application fee, wait your turn, and then you should receive a positive decision if you follow all the instructions and submit a complete and correct application.
Yeah, exactly. I think many students just get really nervous and think it's more complicated than it actually is. But like you said, there is a step-by-step guide and fairly straightforward.
It's difficult because we don't want to scare anyone, but at the same time, we also want to help people retain that respect for the system too and the process. And sometimes we obviously want to convey a certain level of urgency because, as I'm sure you know, listening to this, the migration agency has really long waiting times. So we want you to get that application in the system as soon as possible. However, we don't want you to rush it, because if you end up rushing it, you might submit an incomplete or incorrect application. And then you're in the risk zone, because then, you're into a whole host of difficulties with that. So we want people to sort of retain some level of respect for this process and to read all the information, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and really make sure that they have a good overview of all the requirements before they apply.
Yeah, and of course, plan ahead for the steps, as you mentioned before. If you need to visit an embassy, if you need to do, that also needs to be accounted for time-wise. I wanted to actually ask you specifically about the time. Like, when is a good time to apply? And is there a specific deadline or a specific date by which you should have applied if you're going to start your studies this autumn?
So the short answer to that is now. Apply as soon as possible. So we're recording this in mid-May. And so obviously all of our students coming this autumn have already received their admission, and they've already received their invoice. So what we want is for them to pay that invoice as soon as possible and submit that application as soon as possible. So hopefully all students joining us this autumn, listening to this, have already applied for their residence permit. If you haven't, please go ahead and apply as soon as possible. That's our main message. There's no reason for you to wait if you aren't waiting for necessary documentation. If that's the scenario, of course, wait. But we really want you to get a good place in the queue, and then for you to receive your decision in good time for you to be able to arrive ahead of arrival day in mid-August.
Yeah, exactly.
It might also be good to clarify that as long as the application is complete and it doesn't need to be supplemented, you are kind of protected somewhat to established processing times, but those rules are a little bit set aside should your application need to be supplemented. So it's very important, to not just apply as early as possible, but to, in fact, submit a complete and correct application. Because if it needs to be supplemented, then there is a risk that you might be placed in sort of a parallel queue that might just be good to know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And check things in advance, like funding, as Louise talked about, but also your passport, of course. How long is your passport valid?
Absolutely.
Do you have the documentations you need and everything?
We do have, at Lund University, we've entered into a special agreement with the Swedish Migration Agency. So we do have 2-year residence permit for all our incoming students, which is fantastic. And almost every day I receive questions from students whose passport is about to expire in the year or so leading on from this point. And they want the 2-year residence permit, but they aren't eligible. So they're asking whether or not they can apply to have their passport renewed and then apply for a 2-year permit. And just to emphasize the sort of the urgency needed here, I always say, if you have to wait for a long time to have your passport renewed at this point, go ahead and apply for the 1-year permit, come to Sweden, establish yourself here, have your new passport renewed, and then you can apply for an extension. We really want to emphasize you coming to Sweden, and then everything else can kind of be handled from that point.
Well, that gives us a perfect segue into your continued life with the residence permit and with the migration agency and migration support you might need once you have actually arrived here in Lund. So let's let's move into, we've talked so far about incoming students, but once you are a Lund University student, what kind of support may they need from you then?
Yes, so I kind of follow you throughout your stay at Lund University.
Louise is with you.
Yeah, exactly. If you want me to, that I should emphasize. So it's really important to emphasize, I think also that really sets Lund University apart, that we have support for students at all stages. So of course, students who are about to join us, which we're really excited about, but also students who are here, and also students who are ending their studies and perhaps going on to the after studies permit, or perhaps they've been admitted to PhD candidacy, as Erik will talk to us about later.
Exactly.
So I provide migration-related guidance at all stages, and students are always welcome to either email me, call me, or book an appointment with me. So for our current students, we have issues such as perhaps it's difficult for them to navigate the process of extending their residence permit. So as I just mentioned, we currently have 2-year residence permit, but we have bachelor students who will always need an extension, but we have students who are admitted to a 2-year program, but they only have 1-year residence permit. They will then, of course, need to apply for an extension. So every March, I invite all fee-paying students at Lund University, so I think it's like 800 students to receive my invitation to come and meet me at these huge lecture halls in the university, and I basically talk them through everything they need to know in order to navigate the extension process. Because that can feel particularly scary at that point, because then you've arrived to Sweden, you've paid tuition fee, you've invested financially, physically, emotionally in this, and of course you want to be able to stay and complete your studies. So it's super important, and we do notice that a lot of our students have perhaps some anxiety related to their extension process. So I do that, and then I have a few other information sessions. I quite regularly go out to the faculties and meet students there.
Yeah.
So essentially my support is whatever is required in order to navigate the extension, in order to navigate the process of staying in Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. If you would give one piece of advice for students who are here, or if you're listening now, you're coming here, this will be advice for your future. For current students who are facing an extension, what is the most sort of common problem, and what is the piece of advice you would like them to hear now so that they don't end up in that situation and getting any problems with their extensions?
Well, I would say I probably have 2 pieces of advice. The first piece of advice, and we are really lucky at Lund University because we have the best students. They're so ambitious, they really come here and they do their very best, and a lot of them won't have any issues with their studies. But that's my main point of advice, is probably come here and take your studies seriously. Really invest. I know that it's a lot to take in, coming to a new country, navigating cultural change, environmental change. Perhaps you're separated from your family for the first time, but really try and invest time in your studies and make sure that you navigate this to the best of your ability, because the migration agency does place a lot of emphasis here. They require you to study full time, and they require you to take a certain level of credits. All of this I will cover in these extension information sessions that I will then invite current students to. So that's probably my first piece of advice. And my second piece of advice relates back to the funding requirement. And this isn't a very interesting point, so I apologize in advance. It's quite technical. But essentially, my message here is, in some countries, you are only required to show access to funding, and then you can have those funds, once you've been approved for your permit, dispersed into another account, perhaps not belonging to you. In Sweden, this isn't acceptable in the eyes of the Swedish Migration Agency. They require you not only to have access to your funding, but also to use these funds throughout your stay in Sweden for living expenses. So if and when you apply for an extension, they might actually check your bank account history to see whether or not you've had these funds remaining in your account. So that's a really boring technical piece of advice, but it's something that I see be an issue anyway.
Yeah, it's very important, because I know also I've heard students who've been in Germany or in other countries, and they said, I just need to have money in a blocked account and not touch it for my entire studies. And here's the opposite. It's for you to actually use.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
That's a very good point to make. If I can just add somewhat to what Louise said earlier about following your study plan and taking your studies seriously, is that sometimes we see students who have some issues with their studies, and that might lead to problems with an extension application, and they say, oh, but I've been interning with the Red Cross, or I've been doing this and that also on the side. Like, shouldn't that speak to my advantage? And I think it's good if we're clear about the fact that it is not. It doesn't at all, because your purpose in Sweden is to study.
Yes.
So if you put forward, that sort of evidence to the migration agency, or potentially, if worst comes to worst, to the migration court, it might be good to know that even though that's very commendable on these students' part to do volunteering and these things, it's not really something that speaks to their advantage in terms of the migration process.
It actually has an adverse effect,
exactly.
just as you were mentioning, because there is, as part of receiving a residence permit for studies, the study intent requirement, which we haven't spoken too much about, because generally at Lund University we have really great ambitious students who come here with the proper study or the intention to study, or the intent to study. But it definitely is something that could speak to your disadvantage if there is any reason to question your study intent or your reasons for being in Sweden. So that's a great point.
And that's a really great point, because as you said, Erik, you might feel like, I want to show how ambitious I am.
Yeah.
I'm
Exactly.
studying and I'm doing all of these 10 things, and you think that that's going to be favorable, and it actually could show that you're not so focused on your studies.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not that you're not allowed to volunteer, obviously, but you need to still focus on the studies.
Studies come first, always.
Yeah.
Every semester, in and out, always study full-time, actively.
Yeah.
Life, I always say to my students, life happens. And if something comes up, perhaps you have to take a leave of absence, pause your studies, please come to me and I'll help you navigate that process. But don't assume that you can just simply remain in Sweden without any impediments.
Yeah, exactly. Very good points. And that leads me into my next question, which is a little bit, if you do want to remain in Sweden, you come here, you get maybe a master's degree, and you want to, I really like it here, I want to stay, I want to find a job, or I want to do continued research. You mentioned a magic word before, which was after studies permits.
Yeah.
So let's get into that a little bit. What is that, first of all, and what does it mean, and who can get it?
Absolutely. As we say in Sweden, kärt barn har många namn, and that's just a bit of Swedish for you. It basically means that a loved child can be called by many names. This permit is super popular, but there is no official name for it, so I see lots of different names. Job seeking permit, stay back permit, after studies permit. Generally, I call it the after studies permit to look for jobs in Sweden. Essentially, it's a 12-month permit you can only receive once you have completed your studies in full. It's 12 months, no more, no less. And you are then given this permit to allow yourself to be established on the labor market in Sweden, look for jobs, go for interviews, network with potential employers, and then potentially find a job and transition onto whatever permit then matches that employment opportunity. Yeah. So it's a hand that's stretched out to recent graduates to remain in Sweden and survey the job market. It's super popular. It is quite technical to apply for. There are a few things to consider. Essentially, you're only eligible to apply once you've completed your studies, but you have to apply before your current study permit ends. So we're talking an application window of a few weeks, sometimes even days. But I am also around for this. I support hundreds of students every year with regards to successfully applying for this permit. I include it in my information sessions in the spring every year. But it's a very, very popular permit.
Yeah. Other than applying in this small window that you're mentioning, what are the other requirements to get this after studies permit?
There are a few things to consider. There is one aspect of it which I sometimes notice that students struggle with, and that is the funding requirement. The same funding requirement is applied for this permit as is study permits. And I notice, which you can kind of understand, that it is sometimes difficult for students to produce that level of funds after they've just completed their studies. They perhaps come out the other end of a 2-year or 3-year program, and then all of a sudden they have to show funding for these 12 months up front. I get quite a lot of questions asking if they could shorten the permit. Unfortunately, that isn't allowed. It's 12 months, whether you like it or not. So that's one issue that I notice. Another issue, unfortunately, is the long processing times. Yeah. We haven't really gone into that, but we have this whole thing of being visa required or visa exempt within the Schengen area, and that does affect your ability to enter the Schengen area and re-enter the Schengen area, of course, Sweden included. So we do have scenarios where perhaps a visa required recent graduate will apply for this permit, and then it will take the migration agency quite a long time to process it. And in those months, unfortunately, we recommend that you stay in Sweden and not leave, because if you leave as you don't hold a valid residence permit card, you would then not be granted re-entry to Sweden.
Yeah.
So there are a few things to consider. Yes, but I'm always around if you want to sort of, if this comes to be and you want to discuss, then just reach out to me at any point.
Great. So this is a perfect time to loop Erik into the discussion a bit more. So if you have been in Sweden, you have completed your studies, you took the opportunity in that little window to apply for the after studies permit, and now you're looking for work. So what happens? Let's say I'm 6 months into my after studies permit and I find an amazing job. I'm offered a job. What do I do? What's my next move?
Okay, so if it's normal job, so to say, odds are that you should apply for the work permit. And this is a bit of a special permit process. Maybe we don't need to get too technical about it, but it's a permit process that is actually started by your employer. So you need to have not only an offer of employment, but you actually need to have a signed contract in order to apply properly. So the employer starts the application and then you complete it, kind of.
Okay. Yeah. And you can do that while you are on the after studies permit?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The after studies permit allows you to transition to a work permit. We can also say that you are, in fact, also allowed to work whilst on the after studies permit. The idea of the after studies permit is that you need to be able to show some sort of intent that you will either look for work or examine possibilities of starting your own company. So if you have a long-term employment, I usually say 6+ months, then go for a work permit. Because then it's a little bit questionable if you can really say that you have the intent to look for work. But if you have shorter employments, you can go ahead and start those on the after studies permit, because you can successfully argue that you will still during such an employment still be looking for other jobs. So that won't be a problem.
And we often get questions from students and they're like, oh, but can I only stay 12 months? Some countries have 2 years and so on. And it's like, yeah, but are you planning to be unemployed for 2 years? Like, isn't the idea that you should find a job? And it's almost like they don't quite understand that the idea is that you actually find a job and then, of course, you can stay as long as you have a job.
Yeah. So it's a segue.
Yeah, exactly. It's just bridging there. Yeah. But that's good. I want to get into also doctoral studies, of course, because this is a little bit different in different countries. In many places, this is a study program the same way a master's is. You pay tuition, you do your studies. Whereas in Sweden, it's actually more of a job. Yeah. But then from the migration perspective, there's another complexity. Is it studies? Is it work? And so on. Can you get into a little bit of that? If you are here on your after studies permit, or maybe while you're a student and you get offered a doctoral position, what's the process process then?
Yeah, right. So in order to get a residence permit for doctoral studies, it's technically still a residence permit for studies, but it's a little bit special. You can be granted such a permit for 4 years in one go, which is special, obviously, in relation to the other study permit types. And in order to get it, the requirements are essentially the same as sort of study permits on the lower levels of studies, which means that you need to be admitted to full-time studies. This is really important. So the admissions process has to be done, finished, unconditional before you apply. And I mentioned in the work permit process, the employer initiates the application. This is not the case with the study permit for doctoral studies. Then you apply yourself. You need to have been finally admitted. You need to have funding for the period that you apply for. You need to have insurance, but all these things are generally taken care of. And if you have a PhD position here, most of the time, I would say more than 90%, probably you are employed. So even though you're employed, a work permit is not the way to go. It's rather a study permit, which can be confusing.
Yeah.
But as long as you're admitted to studies, it's the study permit that is the way to go. And so if you have an employment, that's your source of funding. But you can obviously also, we have some PhD candidates who are here on stipends and scholarships and these types of things. And so therefore, that's fine also to use as funding. You just have to fulfill the level of funding required, which is around 10,000 crowns a month. It's much lower than a work permit. Is something that we can say.
So good that we have you guys here. That sounds so complicated.
I was just about to say Erik is also around.
Exactly. I'm also around.
But then we have another permit type, which is a researcher, right? So
absolutely.
just to add a little layer here.
Yes. So as you can tell, the framework is a little bit complex with lots of different permit types. This is why we exist, to usher you through the jungle. So a research permit is a permit for people who have either completed their PhDs or they are at least eligible to start a PhD. So this means that it's not a relevant permit for the majority of people who only hold, for example, bachelor degrees. So you need to at least be eligible. You need to, in reality, you will probably need at least a master's degree, preferably a PhD degree. And this is the permit that you should have if you will conduct research on at least 50% of the time. The migration agency understands that maybe there will be some administration, that even if your job is technically to be a researcher, there might be portions of your employment that might have to do with some other things technically. But as long as you spend at least 50% of your time doing research, it's a research permit. That is the correct way to go. For that, you need, the process is a little bit different. Because there won't be any studies that you're admitted to, but rather you need to have a hosting agreement with the department that will take you on, that will describe what sort of research you will be doing, what sort of funding you have, monthly salary and insurance, and these matters will be elucidated in the hosting agreement.
Yeah, I hope we're not overwhelming you guys too much. There is a lot to think about, but Erik and Louise are here to help, and we do have hundreds, if not thousands, of non-EU citizens who are studying and working here at Lund University. So clearly, you can easily be successful at this as long as you play your cards right and have everything in order before coming here. So we're going to have to wrap up very soon here, but just some final advice from you guys. What do you want to say?
I was just about to say, take it one step at a time. Yeah. Just focus on where are you now, what do you need now, what is required of you now, and then everything else will fall into place as you progress throughout your stay at Lund University in Sweden, one step at a time. For our incoming students, focus on securing that residence permit for studies. If you're here with us at the moment, focus on fulfilling the eligibility requirements for your studies, for your study permit. If you're about to graduate, first figure out what you want to do with your life, which is difficult enough as it is.
Exactly.
And then just take it one step at a time. We are here, as Erik mentioned, we are here for you throughout. We are here to help, and we'll just take it one step at a time.
Yeah. For me, I would say also take advantage of the resources that are at your disposal. So use Louise and I. Also for all staff, there's also HR to help you. So don't be afraid to ask for help, because there are for sure good resources for you, to help you. And also I would like to say that we touched upon it early on in the podcast, that like, don't assume anything. Basically,
Exactly.
Don't assume that the framework here works the same way as it does in other countries. Don't, even though, you know, it's all Schengen and EU, don't assume that you can, for example, move to Copenhagen, which is only 40 minutes away, without that having some sort of bearing on your migration status here, which is something that I see in staff cases sometimes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But I think those are some really good pieces of advice there to take it one step at a time and to not make assumptions, but actually read the instructions and ask questions if you are worried. And again, there are many before you who have done this, so
Absolutely.
Yes,
it's doable.
Always better. Always ask one too many questions rather than one too few.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Use us. I mean, we're here. We share an office. We work full time with this. Both of us. Use us. Email, call.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you both so much. We could talk about this for hours, but we're going to have to wrap up for today. But you'll find more links and information on our website and in emails we send out and webinars and everything that Louise mentioned here at the start. So we hope you will get all this sorted and come to Lund and join us for studies and future work. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lund University International Podcast. If you are interested in learning more about Lund University, you can go to our website, lunduniversity.lu.se.